The lights inside the concert hall were so bright they almost blinded the people sitting in the front row. For the thousands of people filling the seats, the heat from the stage lights was just part of the experience. They had paid a lot of money to be here, to see the man the world called a miracle. Every seat was taken. The air in the room was thick, smelling of expensive perfume, polished leather, and the dusty scent of old paper programs. It was the kind of silence that only happens when a very large group of people holds their breath all at the same time. In the center of that blinding white light sat a grand piano. It was a massive, black creature of a machine, shining like glass. It looked too heavy to move, sitting there on the polished floor like it had grown out of the wood. And sitting on the bench in front of those black and white keys was Julian. He did not look like a superstar. He was a man with slightly graying hair and a plain black suit. He looked small in comparison to the huge instrument. Julian closed his eyes for a moment. He let his hands rest on his knees. His heart was beating so hard he could feel it thumping against his ribs, like a bird trapped in a cage. He wasn't thinking about the music yet. He was thinking about the sound. The specific, heavy sound that would happen the moment his fingers touched the keys. It was a sound that had made him famous. It was a sound that had made him rich. He raised his hands. The movement was slow, almost like he was lifting a heavy weight. When his fingers finally came down, the sound that exploded from the piano was not just music, it was a physical force. It hit the back wall of the theater and rushed back over the audience's heads. The notes were fast, incredibly fast. It sounded like 10 people were playing at once, not just one man. This was the genius everyone talked about. This was the talent that critics said didn't exist anymore. The audience was mesmerized. In the third row, a young woman named Lisa sat with her mouth slightly open. She played piano herself, just for fun, but watching Julian's hands was confusing. They moved like spiders, dancing over the keys with a speed that didn't seem human. She tried to count the notes in her head, but she lost track immediately. It was a blur of motion. The melody was sad and beautiful, twisting and turning in the air. "It's magic," the man sitting next to her whispered. Lisa nodded, but a small frown creased her forehead. She was a skeptical person by nature. She looked closely at Julian's face. His eyes were closed tight. His face was scrunched up in an expression that looked almost like pain, not the joy of making music. It was strange. Most pianists looked peaceful when they played, or they smiled at the audience. Julian looked like he was fighting a battle. But the music was perfect. Too perfect. High above the stage, in a small, dark booth that looked down on the performance, a technician named David was adjusting sliders on a soundboard. He had worked in this venue for 20 years. He had seen hundreds of concerts. But as he watched the monitors in front of him, he leaned closer to the screen. He turned up the volume on his headphones. Something felt off. The sound coming from the piano was crystal clear. Every note was exactly the same volume, exactly the same length. There was no grit, no scraping sound of the fingers hitting the key, no tiny squeak of the bench shifting. It was clean. Cleaner than real life. David looked at the visual display of the sound waves on his computer screen. They were too smooth. David looked out the window at the stage. He watched Julian's hands. They were flying across the high notes, jumping from one end of the keyboard to the other. It was athletic. It was exhausting just to watch. But then, David noticed something. Julian's left hand was playing a low, rumbling bass line. David looked back at his sound screen. The visual wave for the bass notes was perfectly steady. Then, it happened. Julian's left hand slipped. It was a tiny mistake. Just for a fraction of a second, his finger missed the key. He didn't press it down. Anyone watching would have missed it because his hand moved so fast. But David saw it. The finger hit the empty space between the keys. David froze. He stared at his headphones. He heard the note. The deep, booming low C note rang out clear and strong, perfectly in time, even though Julian's hand had touched nothing but air. David pulled his headphones off, his eyes wide. He looked around the small booth, as if someone else was there to confirm what he had just seen. He was alone. He looked back at the stage. Julian didn't flinch. He kept playing, his face still twisted in that strange, pained expression. The audience was swaying, caught up in the emotion of the song. They had no idea. Down in the front row, Lisa was still watching. She wasn't a technician, but she had a feeling. The music was swelling, getting louder and more intense. Julian was playing the trills, a fast shaking of two notes back and forth. His hands were a blur. But then, the music reached a quiet moment. Julian lifted his hands off the keyboard completely to turn the page of his sheet music. For 2 full seconds, his hands were in the air. The piano was open and silent. Yet, the music kept playing. A soft, gentle melody floated through the hall, continuing exactly where it should have been. Lisa blinked. She looked at the piano. She looked at Julian's hands, which were clearly hovering in the air, nowhere near the keys. She looked at the people around her. No one else was moving. No one was reacting. They were all listening to the beautiful, impossible music. "Did you hear that?" Lisa whispered to the man next to her. "Shh," he said, waving his hand at her without looking away from the stage. "It's the best part." Lisa sat back in her seat, her heart beating faster now. She felt a cold chill run down her spine, even though the room was hot. She looked at Julian. He had put his hands back on the keys and was playing again. But now that she had seen it, she couldn't unsee it. The way his hands moved didn't quite match the complexity of the sound. It was like watching a movie where the dialogue didn't match the movement of the actor's lips. On stage, Julian felt a drop of sweat roll down his temple. He didn't wipe it away. He couldn't. He had to keep his arms moving. He had to keep up the act. He didn't know that someone in the lighting booth had spotted the error, and he didn't know that a woman in the third row had seen the ghost notes. He only knew that he was tired. He was so incredibly tired. The song built up to its finale. It was a storm of sound, crashing and loud. Julian threw his whole body into it, leaning forward, stomping on the pedals, making it look as hard as possible. The audience erupted into applause before he even hit the final chord. He slammed his hands down on the keys, holding the pose, his chest heaving. The applause was deafening. It was a wall of sound coming back at him. People stood up. They cheered. They yelled his name. Julian. Julian. He sat there, breathing hard, looking out at the sea of faces. He saw thousands of people smiling, clapping, loving him. They thought he was a genius. They thought he was a god of music. He saw the joy in their eyes, and for a second, he let himself feel good about it. He let himself believe that he had given them something special. But then, he looked up toward the back of the hall. He couldn't see the dark glass window of the technician booth, but he felt a stare. He looked down at the front row and saw a woman looking at him, not with adoration, but with a strange, questioning look. She wasn't clapping. She was just watching. Julian slowly stood up. He gave a small, awkward bow. He felt like a fake. He felt like a thief. The weight of the secret he was carrying was suddenly heavier than the piano itself. He walked off the stage, the spotlight following him until he stepped into the shadows of the wings. As soon as he was out of sight, his shoulders slumped. He didn't look like a genius anymore. He looked like an old man who was lost. Back in the sound booth, David saved the recording file. He labeled it Night Show, Anomaly. He knew he shouldn't keep it, but he couldn't delete it. He had to listen to it again. He had to be sure. And in the audience, Lisa sat down as the people around her cheered. She took out her phone and opened a notes app. She typed 3 words, "It wasn't real." The night was over for Julian, but the storm was just beginning. The truth was like a crack in a dam. Once it started leaking, there was no way to stop the flood, and the water was rising fast. The silence that followed the concert was supposed to be peaceful, but for Julian, it was just loud with his own thoughts. He sat in the back seat of a sleek black car, watching the city lights blur into long streaks of yellow and white. The driver was quiet, and the privacy screen was up, giving Julian a moment to be alone with his secret. He looked down at his hands. They were resting on his knees, pale and trembling slightly. To the world, these were the hands of a master. To him, they were just useless lumps of flesh that had betrayed him. He didn't go to the fancy after-party or the VIP lounge. He told his driver to take him straight to his apartment building. It was a tall, glass tower that looked out over the city, a place that screamed success. But inside, it was cold and empty. The floors were marble, the furniture was leather, and there wasn't a speck of dust anywhere. It looked less like a home and more like a showroom. He walked in and tossed his jacket onto a chair. He didn't bother turning on the main lights. He just walked through the dark hallway until he reached the room with the piano. It was a beautiful room with floor-to-ceiling windows. In the center sat his personal grand piano. It was the same model he played on stage, a silent giant waiting for him. He walked up to it and slowly lifted the lid. He stared at the keys. They were white and black, inviting and terrifying. Julian took a deep breath. He raised his right hand. He just wanted to play a simple chord. Just one note, really, to prove to himself that he still could. He pressed his index finger down on the middle C key. Nothing happened. Well, the hammer struck the string inside the piano, so a sound came out. But it wasn't the note he wanted. His finger had spasmed just before it hit the key. Instead of a clear, bell-like tone, a jarring, ugly thud echoed through the empty apartment. It sounded like a mistake. He tried again, forcing his hand to be still. He played a simple scale, moving up the keys. C, D, E, F. But his fingers wouldn't listen to his brain. They curled inward, stiff and uncooperative. The notes came out choppy and uneven, like a child who had only taken one lesson. He snatched his hand away as if the piano had burned him. He clenched his fist, squeezing until his knuckles turned white. He felt a scream building in his chest, but he swallowed it down. He was frustrated, terrified, and exhausted. This was the reason for the show. This was the reason for the lies. 3 years ago, the cramps had started. At first, it was just a little stiffness in the morning. Then, it became pain. Then, his fingers started locking up. The doctors called it focal dystonia. They told him his brain was sending mixed signals to his hand. There was no cure. There was no surgery. For a pianist, it was a death sentence. He had spent 30 years of his life training his hands to do the impossible, and now, his own body was undoing all that work. He couldn't bear the thought of retiring quietly. He didn't want to be remembered as the guy who got sick and quit. He wanted to go out on top. He wanted to give his fans one last perfect performance, even if it wasn't really him playing. So, he had recorded the perfect version of his masterpiece in a studio months ago, back when he could still play for a few minutes at a time. Then, he spent weeks practicing how to look like he was playing it. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. He sat on the bench, head in his hands, feeling the weight of the fraud pressing down on him. He wasn't just lying to the audience, he was lying to himself. He was pretending he was still the genius they thought he was. The next morning, the sun didn't make things look better. Julian woke up to his phone buzzing incessantly on the nightstand. It was his manager, Rachel. He hesitated, then answered. "Julian, have you seen the internet?" Rachel's voice was high and tight, like a violin string pulled too far. "You're trending." "Is it good?" Julian asked, his voice raspy from sleep. "I don't know," she said. "There are videos. Lots of them." Julian felt his stomach drop. He walked over to his computer and typed his name into the search bar. The screen filled with articles and thumbnails. One video had over 1 million views already. He clicked it. It was a clip from the concert the night before. It was zoomed in on his hands. A text overlay on the video flashed in bright red letters. "Fake." The video played his performance, then slowed it down, then played it again. The person who made the video had added a circle around his left hand. They pointed out the moment his hand missed the key, but the sound still played. Then, they highlighted the moment during the quiet part where his hands were in the air but the music continued. Julian watched it with a cold feeling spreading through his chest. The comments section was worse. "Total scam. I knew he was too good to be true. He's just a puppet. Give the money back. Exposed." He closed the laptop quickly. The room spun. He sat down on the edge of the bed. It was happening. The thing he feared most. The secret was out, or at least, the suspicion was there. He wanted to call Rachel back and tell her to fix it, to deny it, to sue the people posting the videos. But he couldn't. Because they were right. There was a knock at his front door. Julian ignored it at first, but it persisted. It wasn't the polite knock of a neighbor, it was a heavy, insistent pounding. He walked to the door and looked through the peephole. It was a young man he didn't recognize, holding a microphone. Behind him, a cameraman was adjusting his lens. "Julian, can you comment on the video?" the young man shouted through the wood. "Is it true you use a backing track? Are you a fraud?" Julian stepped back, his heart pounding. They were already here. The wolves were at the gate. He turned off the lights in the hallway and stood in the dark, hoping they would just go away. He felt trapped. The fame that used to feel like a warm blanket now felt like a straitjacket. He walked back to the piano room. The sunlight was streaming through the windows now, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It looked so peaceful. He sat down at the piano again. He thought about all the years he had spent practicing in small rooms, his fingers bleeding, his back aching, all for the love of the music. He thought about the feeling of a perfectly voiced chord, the way the vibrations would travel up his arms and into his heart. That feeling was gone now. The music was just a memory. And the world was turning on him. His phone rang again. It was Rachel. "Julian, we need a statement," she said. "We need to say something. The news stations are picking it up. We have to deny it. We can say it was a technical glitch. A speaker malfunction." Julian looked at his hands. He looked at the keys. "No," he said softly. "What?" Rachel asked, surprised. "No, Julian, if we don't deny it, your career is over. They will take everything. The sponsorships, the tours, the legacy." "I can't lie, Rachel," he said. "Not anymore. I'm tired." "It's not lying. It's PR." she yelled. "Think about your fans, Julian. You can't just crush them like this. You can't tell them it was all fake. You have to protect the dream." Julian closed his eyes. She was right, in a way. The dream was beautiful. People loved his music because it made them feel something. Did it matter how the sound was made? But then he thought about the technician in the booth who saw the truth. He thought about the woman in the audience who had watched him with suspicion instead of joy. He thought about the hollow feeling in his own chest. "The dream is already broken, Rachel," he said. "I'm not going to tape it back together with more lies." He hung up the phone. He turned it off so he wouldn't have to deal with the calls or the texts. He sat there for a long time, just looking out the window at the city below. People were walking their dogs, going to work, buying coffee. They were living their lives. He was just sitting in an expensive tower, guarding a secret that was already exploding across the internet. He stood up and walked to the window. He pressed his hand against the cold glass. High above the city, he felt incredibly small. The piano genius was exposed, not just to the world, but to himself. He wasn't a genius anymore. He was just a man who was scared of letting go. But looking down at the busy streets, he realized he didn't have a choice. The current was too strong now. He had to let the water take him where it wanted to go. He turned away from the window and looked at the silent piano one last time, waiting for the inevitable knock on the door that wouldn't stop. The days that followed were a blur of noise and confusion. Julian stayed inside his apartment, keeping the curtains drawn tight against the city. He felt like a criminal hiding from the police, even though he hadn't broken any laws, at least, not the kind that could put him in jail. The only prison he was in was made of his own regret and the expectations of millions of people. Every time he turned on the television or looked at his tablet, he saw his own face staring back at him. News anchors with serious expressions talked about the Great Deception. There were debates between music experts who argued about whether using a recording was artistic choice or grand larceny. The internet was split. Half the world felt betrayed and angry, calling him names that made his stomach turn. The other half argued that the emotion of the music was what mattered, not the mechanics of how it was produced. But Julian couldn't listen to it anymore. He just sat in his living room, staring at a blank wall. He hadn't touched the piano since the morning the accusations started. It sat in the other room like a dead thing. Then came the ultimatum. His manager, Rachel, came over in person. She didn't call first, she just used her key and marched in. She looked frantic, her hair messy, holding a stack of papers. "You have to do this, Julian," she said, slamming the papers down on the coffee table. "The network is interested. They want a special. A live event. Julian, the truth. They are offering you a fortune." Julian looked at the papers without picking them up. "What is it?" It's a chance to clear your name, she said, sitting next to him and grabbing his hand. He pulled away gently. You go on live television. No pre-recorded tracks. No tricks. Just you and the piano. You play for an hour. If you can do it, the scandal dies. You prove you still have the talent. Julian let out a short, dry laugh that sounded more like a cough. You know I can't do that, Rachel. You know what's wrong with me. They don't know for sure, she insisted, her eyes wide. The videos are grainy. The skeptics are just guessing. If you go out there and play, even if it's simple, even if it's slow, you prove you aren't a total fraud. You just say the video was a misunderstanding or a technical error at the venue. People want to forgive you, Julian. They just need a reason. Julian looked at her. He saw the fear in her eyes. It wasn't fear for him, it was fear for her career, for the money she was losing. She wanted him to keep the dream alive because she was living inside it too. I can't play, Julian said, his voice very quiet. My hand won't work. You know that. Just try, she pleaded. Practice for a week. If you can't do it, we cancel. But please, try. He agreed eventually, just to make her leave. He agreed to shut her up. But deep down, he knew it was a mistake. The week of practice was torture. Julian would sit at the piano for hours, forcing his fingers to press the keys. He would try to play a simple Mozart sonata, something he had learned when he was 10 years old. But his fingers had become strangers to him. They would curl up, cramping so badly that he had to cry out in pain. Sometimes he would hit a key, and nothing would come out because he didn't have the strength to push it down all the way. He felt like he was fighting a war with his own body, and he was losing. The day of the event arrived far too quickly. The venue was a smaller theater this time, not the massive arena, but it was packed. Every seat was filled with critics, skeptics, reporters, and the die-hard fans who held onto Team Julian signs. The atmosphere was electric, but not in a good way. It felt like a public execution. Backstage, Julian sat in a folding chair. His hands were shaking so much he had to clasp them together between his knees to keep them still. A woman with a headset came over and clipped a microphone to his lapel. 2 minutes, Mr. Thorne, she whispered. She didn't look him in the eye. Everyone backstage looked at him with a mixture of pity and judgment. They all knew. They all knew he was about to go out there and embarrass himself. Rachel came up to him. She looked pale. You don't have to do complicated stuff, she whispered frantically. Just play a scale. Play chopsticks. Just play something. Just make a sound. Julian looked at her. He felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. It was the calm of a man who has accepted his fate. I'm going to play, Rachel, he said softly. I'm going to play the truth. She looked confused by this, but the stage manager was pushing him toward the curtains. You're on. The walk to the piano felt like it took a million years. The spotlight hit him, blinding him, just like before. He could hear the murmuring of the crowd. It wasn't a polite silence this time. It was a buzz, like angry bees. He sat down on the bench. The piano was a standard acoustic, not his own. It felt stiff. Julian adjusted the microphone. He could see the front row. He saw the faces of people who wanted him to fail. He saw the faces of people who were desperate for him to succeed. He took a deep breath. The air was hot and smelled of tension. He placed his hands on the keys. The crowd went silent, waiting. He pushed down on the keys. The sound that came out was jagged and wrong. His pinky finger refused to extend, so the chord was missing a note. It sounded like a broken toy. He tried again, his left hand coming in for the bass line. But his hand spasmed, and instead of hitting a deep, resonant C note, he hit two keys at once, creating a dissonant clash that made people in the audience cover their ears. He tried to push through the pain. He tried to force his fingers to obey his brain. He wanted to play the beautiful melody he had written, the one that had made them all cry. But his hand wouldn't move. It froze up, locking into a claw shape. He sat there, hammering at the keys with his wrist, making a chaotic, banging noise. It wasn't music. It was noise. It was the sound of his frustration and his grief. The murmuring in the crowd grew louder. People were standing up. Some were laughing, a cruel, mocking sound. Others were booing, shouting fraud. And get off the stage. Julian stopped. He let his hands fall into his lap. The banging noise stopped, leaving the theater in a sudden, echoing silence. He sat there, breathing hard, sweat dripping down his nose onto the piano keys. He looked out at the sea of people. He saw the cameras zooming in on his face, capturing his failure. He saw the disappointment. But then, he looked deeper. In the front row, he saw a young girl. She wasn't booing. She wasn't laughing. She was looking at him with a sad, confused expression. He saw her look at his hand, which was still twisted in his lap. She understood. Julian leaned toward the microphone. He didn't play another note. He didn't try to force his broken hand to perform miracles. "I can't," he said into the silence. His voice cracked, but it was strong enough to be heard. "I wanted to give you the music. I wanted to be the genius you paid for. But my hand, it won't work." He held up his right hand. It was shaking visibly. "I have a condition. It kills me to say this, but I can't play anymore." The anger in the room seemed to deflate. It was replaced by a heavy, shocked silence. The boos died down. The realization swept through the crowd like a cold wind. They weren't watching a scammer get caught, they were watching a hero fall. Julian looked at his hand one last time. "I played the recording because I wanted to be perfect for you," he said. "And that was my mistake. I should have just been honest." He slowly stood up. He didn't bow. He didn't wave. He just walked off the stage, leaving the piano sitting alone in the spotlight. It was the hardest walk he had ever taken in his life, but it was the first true step he had taken in a long time. The show was over. The lie was dead. And Julian Thorne was finally free, even though he had lost everything else. The silence that followed Julian's walk off the stage was louder than any applause he had ever received. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet that hung in the air of the theater, thick with shock and confusion. Backstage, the crew members stopped moving. The man holding the cue cards just let them drop to his side. No one knew what to do. They had spent weeks preparing for a musical masterpiece, a redemption concert. Instead, they had just watched a public crumble. Julian walked down the narrow hallway toward his dressing room, his footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. He didn't look at anyone. He just kept his head down, his ruined hand clutched against his chest. He felt numb. The adrenaline that had kept him standing on stage was fading fast, leaving behind a cold, aching exhaustion. He reached his door and pushed it open, slipping inside and locking it behind him. He leaned back against the wood and slid down until he hit the floor. He sat there in the dim light, listening to the muffled sounds coming from the auditorium. At first, there was just noise, a chaotic mix of voices, people shouting, maybe even chairs scraping as they started to leave. But then, the noise changed. It started as a low rumble, like distant thunder. Then, it grew clearer. It wasn't booing anymore. It was clapping. It was slow at first. Rhythmic. One person clapping, then two, then 10. It wasn't the wild, cheering roar of a crowd celebrating a victory. It was a respectful, steady beat. It was the sound of people acknowledging a hard truth. They weren't clapping because he played well, they were clapping because he had been brave enough to stop pretending. Julian buried his face in his good hand and wept. He cried for the music he had lost, for the years he had wasted lying, and for the strange, unexpected mercy of strangers. He cried until his chest hurt and his eyes were red. Meanwhile, out in the theater, the audience was undergoing a massive shift in perspective. The young technician, David, stood in the back of the room, watching the people around him. The anger that had been so potent just minutes ago had evaporated. In its place was a somber empathy. It is easy to hate a fraud who takes your money and laughs all the way to the bank. It is much harder to hate a broken man who stood on a stage and admitted he couldn't do the one thing he loved most. Lisa, the woman from the third row who had first noticed the mismatched sound, sat still in her seat. She watched the empty piano on the stage. The spotlight was still on it, making the black wood shine. She thought about the expression on Julian's face when he tried to play. It wasn't a face of arrogance. It was a face of pure terror. He hadn't been trying to trick them in that moment, he had been trying to prove he was still real. She felt a lump form in her throat. She realized that the perfect music she had heard on the recording wasn't a lie about his talent, but a recording of his soul from a time when he was whole. He was trying to protect that memory. The event organizers were in a panic, though. The network director was screaming in his headset about dead air and what do we do now. The show was supposed to be an hour long. It had lasted 10 minutes. The cameras were still rolling, broadcasting the empty stage to millions of people around the world. Suddenly, the producer of the show, a woman named Victoria, made a decision. She grabbed the director's arm and stopped him from cutting the feed. "Wait," she said firmly. "Just wait. Look." On stage, a stagehand had walked out to turn off the spotlight, assuming the show was over. But Victoria stopped him. She signaled for the camera crew to zoom in. The main camera focused tightly on the piano keys. They were just black and white plastic, lifeless and still. But then, Julian walked back out. The gasp from the audience was audible. He hadn't fixed his tie or wiped the tears from his face. He looked messy. He looked human. He walked slowly back to the bench and sat down. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the cameras. He just looked at the piano. He placed his bad hand on the keys. He didn't try to play a complex song. He didn't try to be a genius. He just pressed down a single note with his thumb. It was a low, deep A note. He let it ring out until the sound faded into silence. Then, he did something strange. He closed his eyes and started to hum. It was a quiet sound at first, barely picked up by the microphones. But as he hummed, his good hand began to move. He wasn't playing chords. He was tapping gently on the wood of the piano, not the keys. He tapped a rhythm on the side of the instrument, a soft, heartbeat-like thud. His humming grew stronger. It was a melody everyone recognized. It was the main theme from the piece he had played in the fraud video. But this time, it was different. It wasn't fast. It wasn't technically perfect. His voice wavered. Sometimes he missed a note in the hum. But the emotion pouring out of him was raw and naked. It was the sound of a man saying goodbye to his greatest love. He used his good hand to play simple notes, just the melody line, one finger at a time. It was basic, the kind of playing a child learns in their first month of lessons. But combined with the humming and the tapping on the wood, it created a haunting atmosphere. It was a stripped-down, naked version of his masterpiece. The theater was deadly silent. No one coughed. No one shifted in their seat. Thousands of people were holding their breath, captivated by this fragile, broken performance. It was the most honest music Julian had made in years. David in the sound booth watched the levels. He didn't need to add any reverb or auto-tune. He didn't need to fix anything. The sound was clean and pure. He realized that this was the real genius. The genius wasn't in the fingers that could move fast, the genius was in the spirit that refused to be silenced, even when the body failed. Julian played for another 5 minutes. It wasn't a long song. He ended it by hitting the low A note one last time, letting it fade into nothing, and then lifting his hands away from the keys. He sat there for a moment, his eyes still closed, savoring the connection he felt with the instrument, even if it was just a shadow of what it used to be. When he opened his eyes and stood up, the reaction was instant. It wasn't a polite golf clap this time. It was a standing ovation. People rose to their feet as one. There were cheers, but they were different now. They weren't cheering for a spectacle. They were cheering for Julian, the person. They were cheering for his courage. Julian looked out at the sea of people. He saw Lisa clapping with tears streaming down her face. He saw David in the back giving him a thumbs up. For the first time in a long time, Julian didn't feel like a fake. He felt seen. He felt like he had finally played the right notes. He walked off the stage, but this time his step was lighter. The nightmare was over. The truth had come out, and it hadn't destroyed him. It had set him free. Back in his dressing room, he looked at his hands. He knew he would never be the virtuoso he was before. He knew the world of concert halls and million-dollar deals was probably gone for good. But as he listened to the applause still echoing through the walls, he smiled a small, genuine smile. He was still a musician. And that was enough. The days following the concert were not filled with the roar of crowds or the flash of cameras, but with a quiet, steady hum that Julian found much more comforting. The internet was still talking about him, but the tone had changed completely. The headlines that once screamed fraud were now replaced with words like courage, heartbreak, and human. The video of him sitting at the piano, humming and tapping the wood, had gone viral. It wasn't because it was technically perfect, it was because it was real. People connected with the struggle. They saw their own pain reflected in his. Julian stayed in his apartment for a week, just letting the world sort itself out. He didn't read the comments anymore. He didn't need to. He spent his time sitting by the window, drinking tea, and watching the clouds move across the sky. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about his next performance or his next contract. He was just thinking. He felt lighter, as if he had cut off a heavy anchor that had been dragging him down. His manager, Rachel, came by one afternoon. She didn't bring any contracts. She didn't bring any schedules. She just brought a piece offering a basket of fruit and a nervous smile. She sat across from him, looking at the man she had managed for a decade, seeing him clearly for the first time. "The calls won't stop," she said softly. "Every talk show wants you. Every news channel. They want the exclusive interview." Julian shook his head slowly. "I don't want to talk about it, Rachel. I did my talking on the bench. I don't have anything else to say." She looked relieved. "I'm glad to hear you say that. Honestly, I don't think you could handle the circus right now." She paused, smoothing her skirt. "I also wanted to say, I'm sorry. I pushed you too hard. I wanted the dream to stay alive because it was good for business. I forgot that you are a person, not a product." Julian looked at her. He saw the guilt in her eyes. He forgave her instantly. He knew that the music industry was a machine, and she was just a part of it. He had been willing to go along with the lie, too. "It's okay," Julian said. "We were both pretending. But the pretending is over now." A few days later, Julian decided to leave the apartment. He needed to get out. He put on a simple coat and a hat, pulled the brim down low, and walked out into the city. The fresh air felt cool against his face. He walked without a destination. He passed by the theater where he had played. The marquee no longer had his name on it. It was advertising a jazz band for the weekend. It felt strange to see his legacy erased so quickly, but it also felt right. The chapter was closed. He found himself walking toward a small park he used to visit when he was a young student, before he became famous. He sat on a wooden bench near a fountain. The water splashed gently, drowning out the noise of the traffic. He watched a group of children playing on the grass. They were laughing, running around without a care in the world. He watched an old man feeding pigeons on a nearby bench. The man moved slowly, his hands shaking a little as he scattered the bread crumbs. Julian looked at his own hand. It was resting on his knee, looking calm. The tremors were still there, but they didn't scare him anymore. He had accepted that this hand could no longer fly across the keys like a bird. It could only walk. And that was okay. Suddenly, a young girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, ran up to him. She was holding a bright red balloon. She stopped a few feet away, looking at him with wide, curious eyes. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you the piano man?" Julian smiled gently. "I used to be. I'm just Julian now. My mommy showed me the video," the girl said, stepping a little closer. "The one where you hummed." She was crying. "But I liked it. It sounded sad, but pretty. It sounded like a lullaby." "That's exactly what it was," Julian said. "A lullaby for a dream that had to go to sleep." The girl nodded seriously, as if this made perfect sense to her. "I play the piano too," she said. "I'm not very good. My teacher yells at me when I make mistakes." Julian leaned forward, looking her in the eyes. "Don't worry about the mistakes," he said softly. "Mistakes just mean you're trying. The music isn't about being perfect. It's about how you feel when you play. Even if you only play one note, if you mean it, it's beautiful." The girl smiled, her gap-toothed grin bright. "Okay. I'll remember that." She waved her balloon at him and ran back to her mother, who was watching from a distance with a warm smile. Julian watched her go. He realized then that his journey wasn't a tragedy. It was a transformation. He had spent his life trying to be a god of music, untouchable and flawless. Now, he was just a human being who loved music. And somehow, Sharing his brokenness had helped more people than sharing his perfection ever did. He stood up from the bench and began the walk home. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. The city was lighting up, windows glowing gold and orange. It felt warm. It felt inviting. When he got back to his apartment, he didn't go straight to the couch. He walked into the music room. The grand piano was still there, but it didn't look like a monster anymore. It looked like an old friend. He sat down on the bench. He opened the lid. He didn't try to play a masterpiece. He didn't try to prove anything to the empty room. He placed his right hand on the keys. He found a simple melody, a folk song he remembered from his childhood. He played it with one finger, slowly, savoring the sound of each note. His left hand rested on the wood of the piano, tapping a soft beat. He wasn't the piano genius anymore. The headlines would fade, the scandal would become old news, and eventually, people would move on to the next big thing. He might never play in a huge concert hall again. He might never make another record. But as he sat there, creating a small, quiet music that was entirely his own, Julian Thorne found the one thing he had been searching for his entire life. He wasn't playing for fame. He wasn't playing for money. He wasn't playing to impress the critics. He was playing for joy. And for the first time, the music was truly free. The truth hadn't shocked him in a bad way, it had set him free to love the music again, flaws and all. He smiled as the last note faded into the silence of the room, and he knew, without a doubt, that this was the best song he had ever written.